20 seconds. That is all it took for Oscar Piastri's home Grand Prix to collapse. Not during the race. Not during qualifying. Before the race even started. One moment, the McLaren was calmly heading to the grid in Melbourne. The next moment, the car spun violently and slammed into the wall. And millions of fans watching around the world thought the same thing. Cold tires. Driver mistake. Case closed. But hours later, the FIA reviewed the telemetry and discovered something nobody expected. At the exact moment Piastri lost control, the car suddenly delivered almost 100 extra kilowatts of electric power. That is roughly the power of an entire Formula 2 engine. And here is the detail that makes this even more shocking. Just seconds before the crash, Piastri told his team on the radio that his battery was completely empty. No energy. No electric boost. Nothing left. So how does a Formula 1 car go from zero electric power to a massive surge that sends the driver into the wall? That is the mystery engineers across the paddock started investigating. Because if the system really delivered that unexpected power spike, then what happened in Australia might not be a simple mistake. It might be the first warning sign of a serious flaw hidden inside the new 2026 Formula 1 engine rules. And the deeper you look into the data from that crash, the more uncomfortable the truth becomes. So before we break down the FIA findings and the technical evidence that just surfaced, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because the detail most people missed in the Piastri accident could completely change how teams approach the rest of the season. What makes this accident so strange is the moment it happened. Because Oscar Piastri was not pushing. He was not attacking a qualifying lap. He was not fighting another driver. He was simply driving to the grid. Slow pace. Carefully warming the tires. Managing the systems inside the car. This lap is normally the calmest moment of the entire race weekend. Drivers weave gently across the track. They heat the tires. They check the brakes. And they prepare mentally for the start. Everything is controlled. Everything is predictable. That is why the crash in Melbourne immediately confused engineers watching the data. Because the telemetry did not look like a driver who lost control through aggression. It looked like a car that suddenly behaved differently than expected. As Piastri approached turn 4, he followed the same line he had used all weekend. Brake. Rotate the car. Touch the exit curb. Then gently accelerate toward the next straight. It was routine. Nothing unusual. Drivers use those curbs hundreds of times during a Grand Prix weekend. Normally the car absorbs the movement without any drama. But this time something very different happened. Right as Piastri applied the throttle, the rear of the McLaren suddenly snapped sideways. Not slowly. Instantly. The rear tires lost traction in a fraction of a second. And when a Formula 1 car loses traction that quickly on cold tires, the driver has almost no time to react. The car rotated sharply to the left. Piastri tried to correct it. But the tires simply had no grip. Within seconds the McLaren spun across the track and slammed into the barrier. Front suspension destroyed. Front wing shattered. And just like that, the home driver was out of the race before he even reached the starting grid. For fans watching live, it looked like a simple mistake. Cold tires. Too much throttle. Game over. But the engineers inside McLaren immediately started looking deeper. Because the data from the car told a more complicated story. According to the telemetry reviewed after the incident, the power unit delivered a sudden surge of electrical energy exactly as Piastri accelerated out of the corner. Roughly 100 kilowatts more than expected. That is an enormous amount of additional torque. Enough to instantly overwhelm the rear tires when they are still cold. And remember something very important. Only seconds earlier, Piastri had told his team that the battery was completely empty. Which means he was expecting very little electrical assistance. Instead, the car delivered the opposite. A sudden burst of electric power right as the tires were already struggling for grip. That combination created the perfect conditions for the spin that followed. Cold tires. Reduced grip from the curb. And a sudden spike of torque sent directly to the rear wheels. 3 factors. All happening in the same instant. And when those 3 things combine inside a Formula 1 car, the margin for error disappears. But the most important part of this story is not the crash itself. It is what the crash revealed about the new generation of Formula 1 power units. Because the deeper engineers looked into the data from Melbourne, the clearer one thing became. This was not just a driver mistake. It was a moment where the behavior of the car changed faster than the driver expected. And that detail is exactly what has started a much bigger conversation inside the paddock. A conversation about whether the 2026 regulations may allow sudden power spikes that drivers cannot always anticipate. Because if that is true, then the Melbourne crash might not be an isolated incident. It might be the first warning sign of a much larger problem hiding inside the new Formula One engines. And the next piece of information that emerged from the radio communications made that possibility even more concerning. But then another detail started circulating inside the paddock. A detail that made the Melbourne crash feel far less like an isolated mistake. Because when engineers reviewed the radio messages from the reconnaissance lab, something unusual appeared. Oscar Piastri was not the only driver talking about an empty battery. Max Verstappen reported something very similar on his radio. George Russell later confirmed that he also arrived at the grid with almost no electrical energy left. 3 different drivers. 3 different teams. All saying almost the same thing. The battery was nearly empty. At first, that might sound like a coincidence. But inside modern Formula One, battery management is extremely deliberate. Teams control exactly when the hybrid system harvests energy, exactly when it deploys energy, and exactly how much electrical power is available at any moment. Nothing is random. Everything is calculated. So why would several drivers arrive at the grid with almost no battery power? The answer is strategy. Because the hybrid systems in the 2026 cars are incredibly complex. Teams constantly manipulate energy levels to prepare the car for the race start. They want the system positioned perfectly for the first lap, for the launch, for the first overtaking opportunities. And that often means pushing the battery into very specific operating windows. But when the system operates close to those limits, something interesting can happen. The transition between harvesting energy and deploying energy becomes extremely sharp. Sometimes almost instantaneous. One moment the system is conserving power. The next moment it allows maximum electrical deployment. And that transition can happen faster than a driver expects. If that transition happens on a straight line, nothing dramatic occurs. The driver simply accelerates a little harder. But if that same transition happens while exiting a corner, with cold tires, and reduced traction from a curb, the effect can be explosive. Suddenly the rear wheels receive far more torque than they can handle. Grip disappears. The car rotates. And the driver is left reacting to a situation that developed in a fraction of a second. That possibility is exactly what McLaren began investigating after the Australian Grand Prix. Because when the engineers studied the telemetry, the power spike appeared at the exact moment Piastri accelerated over the exit curb. A sudden surge of electric deployment. Roughly 100 kilowatts. Enough to dramatically increase the torque sent to the rear wheels. And when that torque arrives while the tires are still cold, the car can break traction instantly. That is why McLaren team principal Andrea Stella described the crash as a combination of factors rather than a simple mistake. Cold tires, reduced grip from the curb, and a sudden increase in electrical torque delivered by the hybrid system. Each element alone might have been manageable. But together, they created a perfect storm that even a professional driver could struggle to control. And this is where the conversation inside the paddock started shifting. Because if the system behaved exactly as programmed, then the crash was not caused by a technical failure. It was caused by how the current regulations allow power to be deployed. The system did what it was designed to do. It delivered power when the software allowed it. The problem is that the driver may not always know exactly when that moment will occur. And that possibility has made many engineers uncomfortable. Formula One drivers rely on precision. They must feel exactly how the car will respond when they press the throttle. They must know how much torque will reach the rear tires. If that relationship becomes unpredictable, the margin for error becomes dangerously small. That is why the Melbourne accident quickly turned into a much bigger discussion. Not just about Oscar Piastri. Not just about McLaren. But about the behavior of the entire 2026 generation of Formula One cars. Because these new power units rely much more heavily on electrical energy than previous engines. The hybrid system now represents a massive portion of the total power output. Which means the software controlling that energy plays a huge role in how the car behaves on track. And when software controls that much performance, even small timing changes can produce dramatic effects. That is exactly why the FIA began reviewing the data so closely after the Australian Grand Prix. Not just to understand the crash, but to understand whether the system itself might need adjustments. Because the 2026 season has only just begun. Australia was only the first race. The championship has already moved forward to China, where teams continued pushing the limits of these new power units. But the questions raised in Melbourne have not disappeared. If anything, they have become more important. Because what happened to Oscar Piastri might not simply be remembered as an unfortunate accident at his home race. It might become the first warning sign that the new Formula One regulations still contain surprises. Surprises that even the drivers inside the cars cannot always predict. And if that is true, then the real story behind the Melbourne crash might only be beginning. But the most revealing moment came when the FIA engineers began reconstructing the exact sequence of events. Because once the telemetry, radio messages, and power unit data were placed on the same timeline, the picture became much clearer. And also much more uncomfortable. The car did not malfunction. Nothing actually broke. The hybrid system did exactly what it was programmed to do. And that might be the most shocking part of the entire investigation. Because if the system behaved normally, then the real issue may not be the car. It may be the rules themselves. To understand why, you have to look at how the 2026 power units deliver energy. Unlike older engines, where the electric motor played a supporting role, the new generation relies heavily on electrical deployment. A massive portion of the car's acceleration now comes from the electric motor. That means the transition between harvesting energy and deploying energy has become incredibly important. And sometimes, incredibly aggressive. During the reconnaissance lap in Melbourne, the system inside Piastri's McLaren was harvesting energy. That is why he reported over the radio that the battery felt empty. The system was collecting power, not delivering it. But as the car approached turn 4, something changed. The software controlling the hybrid system recognized that enough energy had been recovered. And in that instant, the deployment phase became available again. The system allowed a large amount of electrical torque to reach the rear wheels. Right as Piastri applied the throttle. Right as the car was sitting partially on the curb. Right as the tires were still cold. That timing was catastrophic. Because a sudden increase of around 100 kilowatts is enough to completely change the balance of the car in a fraction of a second. It is like suddenly adding another engine behind the driver. The rear tires simply cannot handle that torque when the grip level is low. The result is immediate wheel spin. And once the rear tires lose traction, the car rotates faster than the driver can react. This is exactly the chain reaction that appears to have occurred in Melbourne. But what worried many engineers even more was the predictability of that transition. Or rather, the lack of predictability. Drivers rely on instinct. They rely on the feeling through the throttle pedal. They rely on experience. But when a software system decides when energy is deployed, the driver sometimes receives power that does not perfectly match what he expects. That does not mean the system is broken.